Welcome to the Mid-Century Modern Assignment presentation. The mid-century modern movement spanned from around 1935 to 1960. In the 1940s, America was emerging from the Great Depression and was reluctant to enter another foreign war, but the attack on Pearl Harbor meant the suddenness of another war and the difficult job of the U.S. government to reach and convince the public of the need to fight. The Office of War Information was formed to communicate the war message across a range of media, which included commissioning illustrators and designers to produce graphic information. The poster was the perfect way to deliver messages during the war because they were inexpensive and immediate. By the end of the mid-40s, as the war ended and troops returned home, wartime needs were put aside in favor of a return to civilian society. In magazines, graphic design took pole position during the post-war period and was referred to as the golden age of magazine design. The 1950s was one of the most optimistic periods. The rise of the U.S. economy for the first time in decades, coupled with further technological advances, had a noticeable effect on the graphics of the time, particularly in advertising. Until the 1950s, photography had taken a back seat in advertising, largely because illustrations could be produced in color and were more adaptable. But it wasn't long before the technology had progressed, and photography took over as the most vibrant and versatile medium. Photography provided the potential to produce hundreds of possible images from countless angles instead of one illustration, making it both the cheaper and faster alternative. Let's look at some of the artists from this time. First, we'll look at Alexy Brodovitch's work. Alexy Brodovitch was one of the most talented designers and photographers of the time and was the art director for Harper Bazaar magazine from 1932 to 1958. Here's another cover by Alexy. He pioneered a new approach to magazine design through his clear, open designs, love of white space, and sharp type. Here's another magazine spread by Alexy. Here's a spread where he cleverly used multiple exposures. And another. This cover mimics that style but has 3 different models. He also taught design classes both at his home and at New York's New School for Social Research. He created many covers with close-up images of women's faces and dramatic negative space. In the early 50s, Brodovitch designed the visual arts magazine, Portfolio, providing the magazine with a new elegance and flow. His arrangement of arrayed type is really eye-catching in this example. Brodovitch was crucial in the introduction of simplified modern graphic style to the U.S. By the 50s, white space was the hallmark of his style. Notice his interesting use of color on the model and in the text here. Next, we'll look at Sippi Pinellas's work. Sippi Pinellas was another important designer at this time, as the art director of 17, Charm, Mademoiselle, and Glamour magazines. She had an amazing eye for incredible photographic composition. She was the first ever autonomous female art director of a mass-market American publication. Here's another example of her experimental compositions. She was also the first woman to be allowed membership in the New York Art Directors Club and made major contributions to editorial design during the 40s. Some of her compositions were like nothing people had ever seen before. During her time at 17 magazine, she commissioned fine artists to illustrate the pages of the magazine and worked with a myriad of designers and photographers, effectively bringing modern art to the attention of a young public. Pinellas was considered by many to be the perfect art director, affording the artists she worked with great freedom. She also created her own illustrations and innovative typography for some of the most experimental women's magazines at the time, including Charm and Glamour. Pinellas introduced a very personal style into the art direction of the period. Her fashion spreads at Charm magazine were aimed at the new working woman. She often incorporated references to the workplace, wildly out of scale to the model. Next, we'll look at Paul Rand's work. Another influential designer to emerge was Paul Rand, whose work included advertising, book jackets, annual reports, posters, and typefaces. These images are examples of his playful advertisements. Between 1936 and 1941, he was art director of Esquire and Apparel Arts magazines, and from 1938 to 1945, he created covers for Direction, a bi-monthly arts and culture magazine. Here's another example of how he incorporated photography, illustration, and experimental typography to create a quintessential mid-century modern style. In 1946, he wrote a manifesto called Thoughts on Design. This is another example of his bold experimentation. Rand was one of the first designers to initiate a more independent American informal approach to organizing space and design. This is often referred to as the New York School. In this example, he uses a scaled-up capital letter F in place of his hand-drawn shapes. Making the F so large and green makes it almost lose its recognizable purpose and become a series of shapes instead. His informal approach to organizing space advocated the open expression and clear presentation of ideas. This is an example of a unique mix of organic shapes and photos. White space was a key element in Rand's work, and primarily spot colors were added to photos and illustrations. Paul famously incorporated witty imagery into his designs. And next we'll look at Saul Bass's work. In the mid-50s, Saul Bass became known as one of the best creators of movie title sequencing in the world, and his title sequencing totally revolutionized the art of film promotion. Bass first produced the film poster for The Man with the Golden Arm, and the director was so impressed with the result, he asked Bass to create the title sequence. This was the birth of the animated title sequence. In subsequent years, Bass collaborated with everyone from Alfred Hitchcock and Stanley Kubrick to Martin Scorsese. Black and white were always featured strongly in his work. Color interest was introduced for backgrounds as an overall or in the form of panels, but was usually restricted to one or two different hues. He mixed photography with a crude, cutout style of simplistic illustration. Sometimes Bass used strong blue, bright red, or orange as a dominant background. Here are more examples of his movie posters. Thank you for watching.